I have full confidence in Catherine and William. Their judgment is sound, their loyalty unquestionable.
Behind a sealed palace door, King Charles placed his signature on a document that could redefine the future of the British monarchy. There was no ceremony, no cheering crowd, and no televised announcement, only a pen awaiting a constitutional file and a decision concerning Prince William that could no longer be delayed. By the time the secret reached the public, Britain was already confronting a royal future that suddenly felt much closer. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Charles knew everyone there understood what was coming. Senior courtiers were summoned to Buckingham Palace, ordered to surrender their phones, and led into a restricted chamber. The king arrived carrying a folder marked for sovereign access. Only. Sovereign access meant material reserved for the monarch and his cleared advisors. William was absent. The silence deepened. The monarch opened the file and stopped at his son's name. Inside lay the Royal Continuity Declaration, formally confirming William as the future king and authorizing preparation for the transfer of sovereign responsibilities whenever the crown judged it necessary. The declaration was a formal plan to keep leadership stable if duties had to pass quickly from one ruler to the next. This was not ceremonial language. It created a working path toward power. Charles tightened his grip on the pen. Signing would protect the institution from confusion, yet push his eldest son toward a burden no father could soften. For several seconds, he did nothing. Then the king wrote his name. William felt the shock before he knew its cause. A discreet message asked him to return to Windsor immediately but offered no explanation. Catherine watched his face change. She asked what was wrong, and the prince answered quietly, "Something has happened." He folded the message and left with questions no one could answer. The declaration carried a confidential schedule showing which briefings, state papers, duties, and constitutional responsibilities would begin moving toward the future king. State papers were official government documents sent to the sovereign for review. Only a handful of people could see the timetable. One senior courtier emerged shaken. In a recorded internal account, he warned another aide that the document was not symbolic. Charles had built a mechanism capable of accelerating William's transition without public warning. As the prince's car approached Windsor, he did not know whether his father had secured his future, shortened his preparation, or acknowledged something the palace had refused to say aloud. But before William could understand what the signature meant for the crown, he had to confront what it meant for the father who had signed it. For the public, William has always been the heir waiting patiently behind his father. Inside the family, the truth is far more painful. Every step that carries the prince closer to the throne also brings him closer to the moment when Charles can no longer occupy it. The secret declaration did not simply confirm a succession. It forced two men who loved each other as family to face the brutal machinery of monarchy without looking away. William entered the private Windsor sitting room and stopped almost at once. Charles was standing beside the fireplace, not behind a desk. That single detail told the prince this was not an ordinary briefing. The king had spent most of his life preparing for the throne, waiting through decades of duty, scrutiny, and uncertainty. That long preparation had taught him one brutal lesson. The monarchy survived only when the next step had already been secured before danger arrived. Charles gestured toward the chair opposite him, but William remained standing. The Prince of Wales, the title given to the sovereign's direct heir, was already carrying the weight of public duty, family responsibility, and the knowledge that George would one day inherit the same burden. Catherine, Charlotte, and Louis gave him a life beyond the crown, but the signed declaration had suddenly dragged that distant future into the present. The monarch chose his words carefully. He told his son that preparation was not a prediction of tragedy, it was protection. Yet his voice faltered before the final word, and William heard what his father could not say. The hesitation made the reassurance feel incomplete. William finally sat and opened the folder. Charles had given him only the first pages. Several annexes remained sealed, including one detailing the conditions under which the future king could receive expanded authority before becoming sovereign. An annex was an added section containing private instructions too sensitive for the main document. The prince looked toward his father, but the king offered no explanation beyond saying that some truths had to be absorbed in stages. Catherine found William later, alone and unmoving, with the folder still closed beside him. She sat near him and waited until he was ready. He admitted quietly that he was not frightened of becoming king. He was frightened of the loss that had to come before it. She reached for his hand, and he held on longer than usual. Charles carried the same fear in another room, though he expressed it through control rather than confession. He believed he had protected his son. William felt he had been pushed closer to an ending neither of them could name. To understand why Charles finally acted, the story must return to the precise moment when hesitation became more dangerous than the decision itself. The declaration was not born from tradition, ambition, or palace theater. It began with one ceremony that nearly collapsed behind the scenes. To the watching public, the event appeared controlled and dignified. But inside the royal household, a missing briefing, an unanswered instruction, and several minutes of confusion revealed a terrifying weakness. Those present would later remember that day as the moment Charles realized the crown could no longer depend on assumptions. The Commonwealth service at Westminster Abbey had been planned down to the minute. The annual ceremony brings together representatives from nations connected through the Commonwealth, a voluntary association linked by shared history and cooperation. Royal schedules, security teams, government officials, and constitutional advisors all followed a strict chain of command because one missed instruction during a national event could create uncertainty far beyond palace walls. William had taken on more public duties, but the deepest powers remained concentrated around Charles. The prince could represent the monarchy before thousands, comfort families, and speak on behalf of the crown. Yet emergency communications still reached only the sovereign and a narrow circle of advisors. That gap had always existed. On that day, it became dangerous. An urgent state communication arrived while Charles was temporarily unavailable. Officials needed an immediate answer, but no signed authority allowed William to read the complete message or issue a response. A state communication was a protected government message requiring the monarch's attention because it could involve national security or an urgent constitutional decision. The future king stood inside a private antechamber as aides argued beyond the door. William heard fragments of the dispute and felt anger rising. He was the heir, yet the system treated him as a spectator at the precise moment leadership was required. One advisor suggested giving him a shortened summary. Another refused, warning that even showing the prince the full document without authorization could break protocol. Minutes passed. Nothing moved. Charles returned and immediately sensed the damage. An aide informed him that the delay had lasted 11 minutes. The king closed the briefing folder, dismissed everyone except his son, and remained silent until the door shut. He then apologized. William had been expected to carry royal responsibility in public while being denied the authority to act in private. That evening, Charles summoned the Cabinet Office liaison and palace constitutional advisors. The liaison served as the secure link between the royal household and senior government officials. He ordered them to draft a continuity instrument, a formal mechanism allowing duties and information to pass safely during disruption. The first version arrived cautiously worded. Charles rejected it. He demanded stronger language, wider access, and a plan that could work before another crisis exposed the same weakness. William would eventually discover that Westminster had triggered everything. And when he did, gratitude would not be his first response. The document may have been created to prevent chaos, but when William discovered the fear behind it, royal duty gave way to a deeply personal reckoning. William did not thank his father for securing his future. He demanded to know why the decision had been made in secrecy. Inside a locked room at Windsor, with no inquiries, advisors, or family members present, the future king placed the declaration on the table between them. Charles had expected concern. He had not expected anger. What followed was not a constitutional discussion, but the collision of two men confronting loss, responsibility, and truths neither could soften. William had spent his adult life accepting that the throne would one day become his. He had never asked to escape that destiny, but he believed any meaningful transition should involve him, not arrive as a completed decision. The declaration had turned preparation into action. It changed what he could read, which meetings he could lead, and how quickly power could move toward him. Charles saw secrecy differently. The king believed silence had protected both his son and the monarchy from panic. Abdication meant a sovereign formally giving up the throne, and he feared that open planning would be twisted into claims that he was preparing to surrender the crown or could no longer continue. Yet William heard only another truth. His father had made the most important decision of his life without him. The prince pushed his chair back. He placed the pages directly before Charles and held his gaze. "Did you sign this because the institution needs me? Or because you believe you may not be able to continue?" Charles reacted at once. He insisted that kings could not wait for disaster before protecting the succession. Succession was the legal passage of the crown from one monarch to the next, and uncertainty around it could shake the government as well as the family. William answered that fathers should not hide choices that permanently changed their sons' lives. The room fell silent. Charles finally admitted that Westminster had frightened him. For 11 minutes, he had imagined the monarchy trapped between an unavailable sovereign and an heir forbidden to act. The king had seen confusion spreading while William stood ready but powerless. He could not allow that weakness to survive. William opened the sealed pages and discovered how far the plan had already gone. The declaration granted him access to classified sovereign briefings and allowed him to chair selected state meetings whenever Charles approved. Classified sovereign briefings were protected government updates normally reserved for the monarch because they could involve national security or constitutional decisions. The transfer was no longer theoretical. It had begun. Charles watched his son absorb the truth, then delivered the final shock. He had not designed the strongest provisions alone. Someone inside the royal structure had pressed him to go further, warning that affection could not be allowed to weaken preparation. William had believed he was confronting his father's private fear. But the next revelation showed that a far larger force had shaped the king's decision. Every royal decision appears to begin with the sovereign, but the crown is surrounded by people whose influence is rarely visible. The secret declaration was no exception. Behind Charles's signature stood constitutional warnings, private pressure, and one uncompromising voice demanding that William be prepared before the next emergency arrived. The king held the pen, but someone else had placed the most difficult truth before him and refused to let him look away. Princess Anne had studied the Westminster failure in silence. The Lord Chamberlain, the senior official responsible for coordinating the royal household, had already ordered a full review alongside constitutional advisors whose job was to keep authority functioning during illness, absence, disruption, or national crisis. Their findings were blunt. The system had protected procedure, but it had nearly failed the monarchy. Anne entered Charles's private office, carrying a written timeline of the 11-minute delay. She placed it on his desk and told him that loyalty to William required more than shielding him from fear. It required preparing him completely. The princess understood that the declaration would not make her nephew king immediately. It would create an orderly transfer of knowledge, access, and limited duties while the monarch remained firmly on the throne. Charles felt the accusation beneath her words. He asked whether she believed his instincts as a father had weakened his judgment as sovereign. Anne did not raise her voice. She simply pointed to the timeline and reminded him that affection could become dangerous when it prevented the heir from receiving what he needed to act. The king pushed the paper away, but she moved it back. Anne had supported the declaration's strongest clause. Whenever national continuity was at risk, William must receive the same emergency briefing as the sovereign. National continuity meant keeping the government and royal authority functioning without confusion during a sudden crisis. The princess refused to soften that demand. Even when Charles accused her of forcing the future too close, Camilla found him alone later, still holding the timeline. She recognized the strain immediately and asked what Anne had said. The queen consort listened as he explained the clause, then asked the question he had been avoiding. Was he preparing William for the crown, or preparing himself to release control? Charles did not answer at once. Camilla saw that the decision had wounded him because it demanded trust at the exact point where a monarch naturally guarded authority. She understood his fear, but she also understood Anne's warning. The strongest provision remained in place. William would now stand closer to the center of power, and everyone inside the household would feel it. Staff loyalties would shift, schedules would change, and access would widen. Yet for Camilla, the new order would carry a quieter pain because every step toward the prince also seemed like one step away from Charles. The signature had remained secret, but its consequences were already moving through the palace, and the first fractures were about to become visible. The declaration was never announced, yet the palace began behaving as though an announcement had already occurred. William received briefing boxes previously reserved for the sovereign. Senior officials altered their routes through the royal offices. Meetings once built around Charles's availability were quietly adjusted around his son. No. Crown had changed hands, but everyone could feel authority shifting. For those closest to the throne, that invisible movement carried pride, fear, and unmistakable personal consequences. William, S. private office received new security clearance almost overnight. Constitutional correspondence arrived in full, rather than as shortened summaries, and daily state reports, once filtered through senior advisors, were placed directly before him. Constitutional correspondence meant official communication dealing with the monarch's duties, government relations, and the lawful use of royal authority. The changes were described as administrative modernization, but experienced courtiers understood the truth. The household was rehearsing a transition while pretending nothing fundamental had changed. Camilla entered a scheduled briefing and stopped. William was already seated beside Charles, with an identical classified folder resting before each man. The queen consort recovered quickly and took her chair, but the pause had been noticed. For years, those meetings had been shaped around the king's authority. Now, the prince was no longer attending merely to learn. He was being positioned to respond. Charles saw her reaction but continued speaking. He asked William for his assessment before turning to anyone else, and several officials immediately faced the future. King. Camilla felt pride in the prince's composure. Yet unease tightened beneath it. She was fiercely protective of the monarch's reign, and every official who looked toward his son seemed to confirm that the old balance had begun to shift. William carried that pressure home long after midnight. Catherine watched him enter with a locked red box in his hand. The red box was a secure case used to carry confidential state papers for senior royal figures. She waited until he placed it down, then asked what had kept him so late. The prince admitted he had spent hours reviewing decisions capable of affecting millions of lives. He had imagined authority as duty, but he had not expected its loneliness. Catherine reminded him that responsibility did not require emotional isolation. Yet, she saw how deeply the new access had changed him. The next shock arrived through a leaked internal schedule. William would chair an emergency continuity meeting while Charles remained present but refused to lead. The exercise would test whether the declaration could function during a real national crisis. Courtiers called it a rehearsal. The prince understood it as something far more personal. Before the meeting began, William made an unexpected request. He asked Charles to meet him alone without folders, advisors, or titles separating them. He no longer wanted to speak as heir to the sovereign. He wanted to speak as a son to his father. The machinery of succession was accelerating. Yet the true turning point would not occur in a briefing room. It would happen when two men finally spoke without the crown between them. For days, Charles and William had spoken through documents, titles, advisors, and carefully controlled language. Then William removed every institutional barrier. He requested a private walk with no aides, no folders, and no prepared remarks. What happened during that conversation changed the meaning of the declaration. It stopped being a secret plan built from fear and became something more personal. A father's final lesson in duty and a son's decision to accept the burden without surrendering himself. William knew resistance could not change his destiny. The crown would eventually become his, and anger would not alter that truth. His real choice was whether he entered the next stage feeling trapped and isolated or prepared and emotionally honest. Charles had reached a painful understanding of his own. Years of royal discipline had taught the king to hide uncertainty, but that silence had made preparation look like a warning instead of an act of trust. William walked beside his father through the Windsor grounds and allowed the silence to settle. Then the prince asked what Charles had felt when Queen Elizabeth began preparing him for kingship. Kingship meant carrying the full duties and authority of the sovereign. But for a royal heir, it also meant accepting that the role could arrive only after a deeply personal loss. Charles stopped. He admitted that guilt had followed every lesson his mother gave him. Each briefing prepared him for a future that required the Queen to be gone, and even imagining that future had felt like betrayal. The monarch had never said those words aloud to his son before. Now, stripped of ceremony, he finally allowed them to exist. William understood at once. He confessed that every new folder, private meeting, and added responsibility now felt connected to the possibility of losing his father. He was not rejecting duty. He was grieving before grief had arrived. Charles placed a hand on his shoulder. The declaration had not been written because he expected to disappear. He said it had been written because history could move without warning, and he refused to leave William unprotected when it did. The king had mistaken secrecy for strength. The prince had mistaken preparation for farewell. William accepted the expanded duties, but he set one condition. The transition must strengthen Charles's reign, not create the impression that the sovereign had already been replaced. Every new responsibility would be presented as service to the reigning monarch, not as a silent transfer of loyalty. Charles agreed. For the first time since the signature, father and son were no longer standing on opposite sides of the document. They were carrying its burden together. The peace lasted only hours. A confidential summary escaped palace control before any joint explanation could be prepared, and Britain awakened to fragments of a decision it did not yet understand. Father and son had finally found peace in private, just as the declaration was about to explode into public view. The document had been designed to prevent panic, yet its existence triggered a national shockwave. Before breakfast, phones lit up across Britain. Broadcasters abandoned scheduled programming, and royal correspondents gathered outside the palace gates. The country was told that Charles had formally prepared William for the next reign, but the deeper meaning remained uncertain. Was Britain witnessing responsible continuity, a hidden warning, or the first unmistakable movement toward a new royal era? A government source confirmed through a documented briefing that William had received expanded constitutional preparation and emergency access. Within minutes, a summary of the Royal Continuity Declaration reached every major newsroom. Constitutional preparation meant giving the heir the knowledge, briefings, and limited authority needed to prevent confusion during a sudden crisis. The source insisted that no transfer of the throne had occurred, but the distinction struggled to survive the force of the headlines. Buckingham Palace responded before speculation could harden into accepted truth. Its statement declared that Charles remained sovereign and described responsible succession planning as a normal duty of the crown, Succession planning was the process of preparing the next monarch while the current ruler continued to reign. Yet the careful language failed to calm everyone. To some, the statement sounded reassuring. To others, it sounded like confirmation that the future had moved closer. A London newsstand captured the national mood. Charles and William appeared side by side across one front page beneath the words, "The King prepares his heir." Commuters stopped, photographed the headline, and argued over its meaning. One man called the signature responsible. A woman beside him asked why such preparation had needed to remain secret. A national television presenter opened a special bulletin with a sentence that spread instantly. "This is not an abdication, but it is the clearest acknowledgement yet that Prince William's future has entered the present." Abdication meant a monarch formally giving up the throne, and the broadcast stressed that Charles had done nothing of the kind. Still, the phrase gave Britain a powerful image it could not easily forget. Outside Buckingham Palace, a small crowd gathered. Some spoke with concern for the king, fearing the declaration hinted at pressure hidden behind palace walls. Others applauded the decision, arguing that preparation showed strength rather than weakness. Charles had wanted stability. The public saw uncertainty. William watched the coverage beside Catherine and grew increasingly disturbed by suggestions that his father was already stepping aside. She reminded him that denials would only feed the noise. "The strongest answer," she said, "would be standing beside Charles and allowing the country to see unity instead of replacement."